Fern Halper, welcome to Partnering Leadership. I am thrilled to have you in this conversation with me.
I'm excited to be here. Thank you.
Can't wait to get some of your insights and talk about your book, Data Makes the World Go Round, the Data, Tech, and Trust Behind AI Success. Before we get to that, though, Fern, would love to know a little bit more about you. Whereabouts did you grow up, and how did your upbringing help contribute to who you've become?
I grew up in New York, so I will say something to begin with. I'm an identical twin, and so I always felt like I needed to be heard. My father was one of the original founders of computer auditing, so I've always been interested in computers and data. I read an article that said data was going to fill a football field and go a mile high, and that was many years ago. So I thought that's probably the industry to be in.
What tremendous foresight on your part, Fern, because you've been in data and analytics for decades, going back to Bell Labs and early machine learning. So when you look at this current moment that we are living through, Fern, most specifically with respect to generative AI, what feels different from your perspective?
Two things feel different. One thing that feels different is certainly the consumer avenue. AI was never really used by consumers. Of course, we had Siri, et cetera, that started that, but this has been a mass consumerization. There's thousands of off-the-shelf tools that are claiming to make you more productive. It's a sea change, I think, in terms of generative AI. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is related to that one, and that is that I see that a lot of organizations are jumping over preliminary steps that they would have put in place if they were actually thinking seriously about generative and agentic AI, and they didn't put those in place. So now we're seeing a lot of struggles and failures, etc. But the potential is enormous.
There is tremendous potential, and in part because of that, Fern, what I find is a lot of boards have been asking about AI strategy. A lot of CEOs and leadership teams come up with an AI strategy, and they're throwing all kinds of things at the wall. And right now, if you talk to any executive or CEO, they say AI, yes, we do that. We've got AI in different parts of our business and organization. Part of what you're saying is they have skipped some of the early or critical steps, and that can cause issues. So, what do organizations need to think about before they can really form an effective AI strategy or AI implementation in the organization?
I think it's important to take a step back and think about AI. And there have obviously been many waves of AI, and the generative one is the one that we're talking about, but there have been other waves before that. I was involved in the one in the 90s, for example. And when I think of AI, I think of machine learning, I think of using your company's data. I know that there are lots of applications out in the market that organizations are using, but to me, that's not a strategy, right? To me, a strategy is I'm a business, I have a need, or I have a problem, and can AI help me solve that problem? And if it can, that's great. Then you say, okay, what's it going to take to solve that problem? And I don't want to boil the ocean in the first go round, but if I have a problem, like an old traditional one would be, I'm concerned about churn with my customers. I'm losing a lot of customers. What's the best AI approach to actually think about building models that are going to help me predict churn so that I don't lose as many customers and I can be proactive as opposed to reactive? And then I think about, okay, that seems like a good thing to do. What data do I actually have that can help me with that? I'm going to inventory the data and say, okay, I can use this kind of data to help me figure that out. And do I have the skills in place? If things go well, am I going to be able to put this in production? And importantly, it's not just do I have the data, but do I have good quality data that's governed, that's going to help me? So that a lot of organizations, they have a strategy. I'm going to do AI, and maybe that helps them to be more productive in the initial instance. But until they start really using their company data, they're going to hit what I call a value ceiling. So they may get some productivity benefits, but in terms of actually generating value at the company level, they need to start thinking about their data. So that was a roundabout way of saying have a strategy, have a business need, inventory your data, start to build a pilot, see how it works, put metrics in place that are going to tell you, yeah, churn reduced by 10%. Once you start with the metrics and you can prove value, then it just becomes a ball that keeps getting bigger and bigger. I call it a virtuous circle. People see the success, they want to do more, and success begets success, and you're off to the races, basically.
That's a great way of thinking about it, Fern. And I know in the book you also mentioned two sides of AI. A lot of organizations have been focused on everyday productivity, whether through tools, ChatGPT, Claude, and there are benefits in that. But a lot of times when people talk about AI, that's what they're talking about. You are talking about thinking through the organization's strategy and or issues or problems that the organization has, and then focusing on use of AI to understand the data you have better inside your organization to tackle that problem or that strategy. One of the challenges, though, with a lot of organizations that I've interacted with, they don't have very good data. The data is at issue itself. How do you then address that? If you look at the data, there are all kinds of silos, there are all kinds of different platforms or places where data has resided. The quality varies. So obviously, whatever you get from that data is going to be flawed because the data is flawed. How do you approach that?
That's an undertaking. It's a journey, a data management journey. And for small companies, it may be as simple as just thinking about a small database or data mart that you can put your data in. Of course, you're going to need people like data engineers and database people who are going to help you understand how you're actually going to store your data. And then once you figure, if you're a larger company, I think a lot of larger companies are already addressing this for sure, right? They're building data warehouses and data lakes and data lake houses. And if they have silos, one of the big things that they're trying to do is to try to determine how to unify all of the data so that you don't have all this fragmented data across your organization, and customer means 10 different systems, right? So they're trying to put metadata, data about data together. They're trying to put semantic layers in place to provide context to these AI systems about their data. But make no mistake, it's a journey. It's not something that necessarily is going to happen overnight. But that I see succeeding with it, typically they're using the cloud because the cloud is providing, not all organizations can do that based on they may have privacy issues and they're not going to want to do that. But a lot of these cloud platforms that are out there can help provide the scalability and the tools that you need to actually be able to unify not only the structured data that your organizations have that you're used to dealing with, but now all of this text and image and video data that I think organizations are starting to deal with even more. So you really want to try to unify it in some way. And then once, as you're doing that, I should say, you're checking for data quality, making sure that the data is accurate, complete, timely, consistent, all of those auditing types of things that people are concerned about, that it can scale, that your platforms can handle different data types. And you're thinking about how you're going to govern the whole thing once you're going to use it with analytics and AI. And we'll say that a lot of companies, they went down the BI route, right? Just using slicing and dicing and shaking and baking their data using those self-service BI tools that have been around forever, or even their Excel spreadsheets. So they're thinking about that. Some have thought about this already and have put data platforms into place, which is good. So then they just have to take the next step and say, is the data ready for AI? Is it trusted? Is it governed? Is it, do I understand it? Because that's also another issue that companies run into where they don't really understand what data they have. They haven't necessarily inventoried it. And if they have it, they don't really understand what it means from a business perspective. So they need to give it business definitions so that the tools can use it.
It's interesting, Fern. First of all, most organizations have a lot more data if they really reflect on it. There's a lot more data that they are sitting on that I think many of them don't recognize all those data points. The other thing that I'm thinking about as you're talking about this is that it therefore shifts the requirement of who does some of this thinking from the people that traditionally been dealing with IT, data, the technology part of the organization to much more the executives that are operational, the CEO and others to reflect on this. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that business is a stakeholder, right? They have to be involved in this. The organizations that I see succeed typically have business users as stakeholders who are part of this. And organizations are doing things like creating data products where they think of data as a product. And since it's a product, you want people downstream to be satisfied with the product. And so the business actually owns the product at the end of the day, but they may or may not be involved in its day-to-day upkeep. It's basically an effort where the data engineers and IT and whoever was owning the data was helping with it, but the business users are providing the information about that product, which could be as simple as a data set or some sort of derived asset that comes from the data. And those organizations that are thinking of their data that way as an asset, as a product, they tend to be more successful. And that means that business people are involved and it's not just about IT.
Now, in order for the listeners to be able to visualize some of the use cases, in chapter 1 of your book, you also talk about some use cases, whether churn prediction or predictive maintenance. What are some of the use cases that you have seen different organizations embrace so we can start visualizing the types of potential tapping into the data within the organization can provide us?
So for generative AI, which I think is what organizations are thinking most about, one of the early use cases that I see organizations putting in place, and it's a good one for generative AI, is actually taking their call center notes or wherever they get information from customers complaining or being happy or asking questions or whatever. And they take that and they put it through a generative AI model, which is very good at summarizing what what was said in the documents, all of those notes that people were taking or email or whatever it is, and it can classify those into certain. So I've heard many organizations they're doing that, and sometimes they do it as a one-off. They'll take all of their documents and just put it into their private instance of ChatGPT or whatever, and they'll see the classification. But some organizations try to actually put that into production. So they'll use more technology and they'll provide systems. They call it retrieval augmented generation, RAG. So they'll actually try to build systems that way so that you use the company data, you take the prompt, and it's ongoing and you put the thing into production. So that's a popular use case. Of course, chatbots are obviously and assistants are popular use cases. So you said earlier about lots of data that you don't even think of as data. So things like operations manuals and process flows and all of that organizations have, they'll build they'll take all of that information and then they'll build a bot that helps an elevator repair person actually repair the elevator. So that's another one. They're building lots and lots of bots. But now organizations seem to be very interested in building agentic systems, so agents that sort of act autonomously. And they're thinking about for that, even though it's still really early days with that, is automating workflow. Things like in supply chains, that's a popular area where they would think, oh, I can build an agent that's going to go out and get pricing information. And then another agent is going to go out and compare supplier prices. So get the prices, and someone else, another agent, I said someone else, I can't believe I said that, but that some agents are thinking that they're calling these agents their team members, which I find a little bit disturbing, but okay. So, but that's what they're doing. And they're trying to build these systems that are going to automate decision cycles. And there may be a human that looks over it, but that's where a lot of this is trying to move. I will say, though, that a lot of organizations I talk to are saying, whoa, I got to put some guardrails on this. And then I hope that their CEOs understand why they want to put guardrails on it, right? Because they're concerned about what these agents can do, because sometimes it can be a little scary and agents fight for control and other things that you read about in the news. So
the responsibility does stay with the humans at the end of the day. Now, I do want to get some more of your thoughts on agentic AI as well, Fern. As you were talking about it and you mistakenly said them, I was thinking about someone having written a piece on McKinsey, and someone at McKinsey had said they had 20,000 agent employees. And the person was making fun of that how can you call them employees? Do you call the computers you have in your organization employees as well? So it is pretty interesting how, in essence, because of the functionality of some of these agents, whether for PR purposes or other purposes, some organizations are thinking about them as employees and are therefore assigning managers to manage those employees. So we are going into a lot of gray area with respect to agentic AI. Where do you see the real application rather than the hype?
what I see organizations doing, I mentioned the supply chain, and there are organizations that are trying to use agentic AI in supply chains. And look, a lot of vendors are coming out of the woodwork, or they were here already, but now they have agent help to do things like replenishment planning. So that makes it easier for people. They don't have to build the agents themselves, right? They can use a vendor's agent to do that. So I definitely think supply chain is an area that's ripe for agentic AI, a workflow that people understand, and can make sense to automate, not necessarily everything, but things that are routine types of tasks that you don't necessarily need people to do. Go out and get pricing information, right? An agent can do that, or compare the prices of these 55 vendors or whatever. Like maybe an agent can do that. But when it comes to the decision, hopefully a person is looking at that. We're going to go, hopefully the agent says, I suggest X, Y, and Z, and it will say I, and then the human in the loop will say, yeah, that makes sense, or it doesn't make sense. But people are building all sorts of single agents for themselves, right? Agents that go through their emails and prioritize tasks, and lots of different productivity types of tools that agents can help with. And again, that's productivity. I guess it saves cost, but things that are more of a process make more sense. It was interesting because I was talking to a company and they were saying, we're going to build, this was a while ago, we're going to build an agentic system. They had pop-up stores and they wanted to automate the whole process of identifying what locations to have pop-up stores in, getting the contracts out to whoever owned the building, that sort of thing. And as they were thinking through it, they realized that's great, except we don't really understand the process of pop-up stores. So we have to figure that out first. And that's why I think that in my research at TDWI, I see less than 10% of organizations actually have multi-agent systems in production. It's just they're really starting slow with sort of single agents, and then they'll move to more multi-agent systems, I think. So those are some examples of what I see with agentic AI.
In many instances, as you mentioned, the organizations need to focus on some of their data, some of the governance issues, all of those things before unleashing these agents within the organization or in the world.
It's scary. I think I heard of one company that actually told its people to go crazy and come up with all sorts of agents. And they ended up creating tens of thousands of agents. And now the company is saying, oh, I didn't mean that. Which ones actually make sense? And when you think of agents, I bet a lot of people were creating agents that were doing the same thing, right? So now you have a bunch of agents doing the same thing as opposed to thinking about it in a systems view of I have an agent that can do this and what groups in my organization can actually make use of this agent that can do X, Y, and Z. So an interesting time, that's for sure.
Another impact, Fern, is that it is really impacting organizational strategy, strategic thinking, and where value resides. You also share examples of companies trying to optimize yesterday's model. Where do you see value shifting as a result of AI and generative AI, where it's not just focusing on process improvement and optimizing, as you say, yesterday's model, but rethinking the model itself?
That's a really good question. I'd have to think about that because I haven't seen many examples of that. I've seen it in process improvement and efficiency and all of that. And maybe that's why some CEOs are stepping down, right? Saying that they're not ready for the real transformation that AI can provide. So it's a good question. And you think about people in my circle talk about the $1 billion company that's going to have one person running it. But I think it's a little different than that. It's the $1 billion company that's going to have multiple people running it. It seems like there always be jobs for people who are overseeing some of the processes, people who are mathematical, who can come up with the next rendition of what these agents should be doing, and people in the loop and governing the whole thing and making sure it doesn't make mistakes. It's a pretty, I don't want to say it's sobering, it's a little concerning view of what businesses can actually transform into, because I've been doing a lot of thinking recently about the erosion of original thought. And it just seems like that in some areas, that's where this is heading, to your sort of knowledge and then critical thinking and all of that. So that has me concerned, I will say.
It is incredible, Fern. I see a lot more employees and even executives at organizations doing that. You also reference shadow AI. There is a lot of shadow AI use in organizations. Where do you see that most clearly? And what are ways that you recommend executives, organizations address that?
What I see is the shadow AI is happening in every organization, every department across the company. It's just happening, face it. So that's happening. And what I see organizations doing who are somewhat successful is that they realize that it's going to happen. And so if it's going to happen, at least let's clock in the tools that are being used. So they have a committee, and it's usually in partly in IT, but it can be owned by the chief data officer, chief data and AI officer, or whatever, or the governance area where they actually have if you want to use a tool, let us know what tool you're using, because obviously then we can make sure that you're not paying double licenses across the company, for example. So come in front of the board or answer questions, and then we'll yay or nay it. Usually I think that they yay it, but then at least they have some control because they see what's going on. And then they also will put AI literacy programs in place to help people make better use of these tools that they're using, just like data literacy programs are being put in place now. Organizations are putting AI literacy tools in place, and depending on who you are in the organization and what your role is, you're going to be required to take a certain amount of training. It may be 5 hours for those that are dealing with much more complex usage of the tools. It'll be longer, and people can get excited about it, but the organizations that succeed get people excited about it because obviously this is a cultural change also. So that's what I'm putting. And when people are more literate, then hopefully governance has better results also because they also understand the need for it.
Data and AI literacy is essential in the organization. What I wonder, Fern, is that as more and more employees and more of us depend on these LLMs, if we are gravitating to the sameness of the averages
Yeah.
rather than real differentiation.
I just wrote a blog about that and looked at the studies that were being done about what parts of your brain actually perk up when you're not using an LLM versus when you are. And I agree, where it's, innovation comes from the long tails, right? It doesn't come from the middle. And it just seems like we're gravitating towards the middle. And so I think that helps people who are actually a certain type of thinker, but it doesn't help most of the people in business, or it doesn't help the business because you're just regurgitating the same thing. And there have been studies that show that as models retrain themselves on the output of previous output, that there's a decline in even what is produced. So now you're going to get hallucinations potentially and problems with all of that. It just reminds me of a bad sci-fi show, right? Where people were, their ancestors created some technology that they use and everything seems great until it's not great and they just seem so pathetic. So that's how I sort of view. I really value individual thought and innovative and creative and critical thought. And you just don't want to see people relying too much on these tools. They can certainly provide value, and the value can be enormous, but you don't want to take away the people.
We have to challenge ourselves, our teams, and organizations to be able to do that. We're going to have a hard road ahead because it is making a lot of processes easier. I jokingly sometimes compare it, Fern, to right now using Waze, in that for me, I live in DC area. I'm very familiar with a lot of roads in the area, but after a few times having gotten stuck in traffic that I was not ready for, I've started using Waze, and Waze tells me where to go, to the point where in most instances I'm not really thinking about the driving
Right.
anymore. Waze is telling me where to go. In some aspects of how organizations are putting together their marketing or some of their strategies and some of their thinking, I see people doing the same thing. That can be of real concern. So we need some of that originality injected in addition to some of what you've mentioned for CEO or executive listening with respect to themselves as a professional, as a knowledge worker. How should they transform themselves?
I think that they need to educate themselves because otherwise they're not going to understand what it's going to take to use AI in their organizations. Read books, as I just wrote a book that takes it from the soup to nuts about what you need to be thinking about. Think about attending executive education programs. There's no shortage of ways to educate yourself, but potentially start thinking about data and educate yourself about data. Everyone, oh, it's the new oil. Of course, there's been a lot of comments about it's not the new, like you have to refine the oil and you have to refine your data. But maybe the CEOs listening don't even understand what that means. So just start to educate yourselves. I just think that's the first step that anyone in any position who wants to move forward and grow with what's happening needs to do.
It's absolutely essential, Fern. I couldn't agree with you more. And one of the challenges that I see with AI is that it has made many of us lazier in that understanding concepts, I know for different people is slightly different, but for most of us, it requires depth of thinking, depth of reading, depth of reflection. In many instances, I understand things better when I try to write about it. So there is a level of wrestling with ideas that helps us understand them more. Now, with us wanting to get summaries of summaries or the 4 bullet points on a book or a conversation or an insight, we then don't wrestle with the idea and don't understand it with the same depth that it requires. So, couldn't agree with you more on that. And obviously, your book is a great one to read and wrestle with. For the audience to both follow your work, your writing, and find your book, where would you send them to, Fern?
In terms of the book, they could go to Amazon and just Google the title of the book, Data Makes the World Go Round, the data, tech, and trust behind AI success. They can come to my blog, datamakesworld.com, or I'm the founder of the AI Foundations group, so they can go there. And
That's great advice as well, and appreciate you, your insights, and your book, Fern. Data makes the world go round, the data, tech, and trust behind AI success. Thank you so much for joining me in this conversation, Fern Halper.
thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation.